On the night of the 23rd of March 1945, the first artillery salvos thundered along the western bank of the Rhine. The flashes of gunfire reflected off the murky water like thousands of eyes opening wide in the dark. According to reports from the 9th Army, the operation began at 17 hours, mobilizing more than 4,000 guns, ranging from British 25-pounders to American 240mm self-propelled artillery. Within 4 hours, the sky over western Germany seemed to shatter. The Germans called that night the Night of Steel, while the Americans wrote in their war diaries, "The river glowed." When the cannons finally fell silent, the stillness lingered just long enough for both sides to understand. The impossible had begun. At 21 hours, hundreds of amphibious DUKWs rolled down the riverbank. According to the US 21st Army Group record, each vehicle carried 12 soldiers and 2 crewmen, moving through the 8-10 knot current across a river stretched 1,300 feet wide. On the opposite bank, the Germans still believed they were waiting for landing boats, but the trucks that could swim erased that notion within the first hour. The river that had once marked Germany's frontier had become nothing more than a straight waterway. From above, Major General Jacob Devers observed through his binoculars and exclaimed, "They are driving across." The statement was recorded in Field Report No. 1079, sent to the Supreme Command only hours later. Behind those figures lay a river crossing on an unprecedented scale. 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies, and 2,000 wounded evacuated within 72 hours. Not a single bridge was built. No engineer unit had to lay pontoons under fire. Instead, there was a silent flow of vehicles gliding over the water. The British called it Operation Plunder, the Americans called it the Rhine crossing, and the Germans used just 2 words in their telegrams: catastrophe. In his report, dated March 25, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring wrote to the General Staff in Berlin, "They did not build bridges, they drove across the river." That simple sentence was cited in the German Army Group H War Diary, and after the war, Montgomery himself recalled it in his personal notes. They did not build bridges, they drove across the river. The line became a symbol of the turning point on the entire Western Front, according to the US. 9th Army Operational Summary. By dawn on March 24, 3 divisions had completely crossed to the east bank. The Germans were bewildered by the sight of DUKWs crawling out of the water, their engines still dripping wet but running smoothly as if the river surface were a highway. Prisoners captured on the first day confessed, "We were ordered to aim at the bridge, but there was no bridge." Many German officers reported enemy tanks appearing in the rear, without realizing those were DUKWs loaded with mortars and shells, crossing from directions their defense maps had never marked. According to statistics from the British Second Army, on the second night of the operation, every hour, 50 DUKWs left the western bank, equivalent to 125 tons of supplies or 1,250 troops ferried across. The entire logistics system operated like a floating industrial assembly line. Colonel George Sims, logistics officer of 16 Corps, called it a floating highway. He wrote, "We weren't building bridges, we were building tempo." Rhythm became a weapon. In industrial warfare, rhythm killed doctrine. Above, the sky lit up as 1,700 transport aircraft and 1,350 gliders from Operation Varsity appeared, dropping 16,000 British-American paratroopers into an area just 6 miles from the river. On the ground, the DUKWs carried ammunition, medicine, and even the first hot meals across the water. Private Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne Division recalled, "We were fighting for this crossroad when those truck boats came out of the woods. No splashing, no sound of engines choking, just trucks, dripping wet. In that moment, he realized he was witnessing a new way to wage war." By dawn on March 25, German resistance had collapsed. 16,000 German soldiers were captured within the first 72 hours. British and American airborne and armoured units had pushed 50 miles into German territory, shattering the entire Ruhr defensive line. According to Allied operational assessment, April 1000, 945, the advance rate reached an average of 50 miles per day, 3 times faster than the initial projections. When Field Marshal Kesselring received the final report from the 1st Parachute Corps, he wrote only one sentence: "If they can drive across the river, the war is over." Years later, in a London press conference room, a black and white film was shown again. On screen, the DUKWs were still rolling, headlights glinting on the calm water. A veteran stood up under the yellow light and said, "We drove across history." The hall fell silent. The projector whirred steadily, the film strip trembling slightly. In that silence, one could almost hear the engines of that year echoing again, merging with the sound of the Rhine. According to the post-war analysis of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, the Rhine crossing shortened the European war by at least 3 weeks. General Omar Bradley estimated that if bridges had to be built and the river crossed by traditional means, Allied casualties could have exceeded 50,000. Those numbers were more than statistics. They were proof of a radical transformation, from tactical warfare to industrial warfare. On March 26, Eisenhower stood on the bank of the Rhine, watching hundreds of DUKWs shuttle back and forth like looms. "With these things," he said, "every river in Germany is now a highway." Bradley smiled. "The Germans are just figuring that out." 3 days, 1 river, and an empire collapsed. The wheels kept turning, carrying troops, ammunition, and the end of an era Germany once believed eternal. In April 1942, off the coast of Provincetown, Massachusetts, a U.S. Coast Guard patrol vessel ran aground on a sandbar during a night patrol. The ship leaned in the fog, its signal lights flickering across the cold water. On shore, military trucks stood helpless, their wheels sunk in wet sand. There was no vehicle capable of both running on sand and entering the water to pull the ship free. According to a memorandum from the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the incident was classified as minor, but in reality, it sparked an idea that would change the entire way Americans waged war. In the report filed in Washington, the final sentence was underlined. A vehicle that could move on both land and water would solve this forever. 3 names appeared immediately afterward in the file: Palmer C. Putnam, an industrial engineer, Rod Stevens, Jr., a yacht designer from Sparkman and Stevens, and Dennis Pulston, a British hydrodynamics expert working for the U.S. Navy. They met in a conference at the OSRD headquarters in Boston and jointly signed a proposal titled Truck Boat Hybrid for Coastal Operations. Putnam sketched the first concept on a notepad: a truck with a watertight hull, large wheels, and a rear propeller capable of self-adjustment upon entering the water. Stevens added preliminary drawings, and Pulston calculated buoyancy and displacement. All 3 believed the principle could be realized within a few months. "We are not designing a miracle," Putnam wrote. "We are designing a necessity." Records show that when the plan was first sent to Ford Motor Company, the company's engineering board rejected it, stating that manufacturing within 2 months is impossible. On the 23rd of April 1942, the project was transferred to General Motors Corporation, specifically the Yellow Truck and Coach Division in Pontiac, Michigan. There, Chief Engineer Frank Spear immediately assembled a small team that worked non-stop inside a factory already producing GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks. According to GMC Engineering Log No. 2247, they decided to use the entire drivetrain, gearbox, and engine of the CCKW, modifying only the frame and hull to make it buoyant. This idea saved months of research and millions of dollars in testing. Only 38 days later, on the 2nd of June 1942, the prototype of the Amphibious truck rolled out of the workshop. It carried the code DUKW, a name derived from GMC's internal system: D for 1940, 2, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. According to the U.S. Army Service Forces test report, the vehicle was 9.4 meters long, weighed nearly 5 tons, featured a welded steel watertight hull, and could float when the water level reached the door of the cab. The drive system powered the rear axle through an intermediate shaft, while simultaneously turning a 25-inch propeller, giving it a speed of 5.5 knots on water. For the first time in history, a military truck could leave the road, enter the water, and return to shore without assistance. The first test took place on Lake Street, Clare, Michigan, witnessed by Major General Jacob Devers and representatives from the War Department. Engineers drove the vehicle along the shore, plunged it straight into the lake, water washing over the hood, and yet it kept floating, the propeller slicing steadily through the waves. After 10 minutes, it climbed onto the opposite shore by itself. "It climbed out of the water like an animal," Devers wrote in his journal. When he asked about the cost, engineer Spear replied, "About $10,750 per unit." The general smiled. "Cheaper than a bridge." That very day, he sent a telegram requesting mass production. Another breakthrough was the Central Tire Inflation System, CTIS, a mechanism allowing the driver to adjust tire pressure while the vehicle was in motion. At 10-12 pounds per square inches, the tires expanded to grip sand or mud. At 40-45 pounds per square inches, the truck achieved maximum performance on hard surfaces. This was the first time in history that automatic tire pressure control technology had been applied, later becoming standard on all modern military vehicles. The design notes stated, "For every terrain, one vehicle." It embodied the American philosophy of flexibility, creating a single vehicle capable of adapting to any environment instead of producing multiple specialized models. In June 1942, Major General Jacob Devers presented the prototype in Washington before the War Department's Technical Board. In Report No. 318 sent to the War Department Ordnance Branch, he wrote, "The prototype operated flawlessly. It exceeded all expectations for water performance." After the demonstration, Secretary of War Henry Stimson signed an order for 2,000 DUKWs. The Pentagon regarded it as a strategic turning point, not merely a transport vehicle, but the first bridge that drives itself. The first photographs of the DUKW were released to the military press, showing a machine both rugged and graceful, a high bow, a curved hull, and large wheels rising from the water. Some young officers nicknamed it the Duck, the Army's swimming bird. In the Pontiac plant, welding machines thundered through the night. Engineers hung a short sign over the door. "From land to sea in one motion." It was more than a slogan. It was the beginning of a new philosophy of warfare, turning every natural barrier into part of the battle route. According to the post-war Technical Review of Amphibious Vehicles, 1946, the DUKW was a perfect example of pragmatic engineering, American practical technology, simple, efficient, easy to produce, and easy to repair. Within 2 months after the prototype's approval, the mass production line began operating. That moment marked the point when a small idea born from a grounding incident became a strategic weapon. From the quiet waters of Lake Michigan, the iron duck was about to leave its nest, swim into the ocean, and a few years later cross a river once deemed impassable. In 1943, as the United States had fully transitioned into a total war economy, the DUKW emerged from the testing phase and entered industrial mass production. The GMC Yellow Truck and Coach plant in Pontiac, Michigan, became the center of a race between engineering and time. According to War Production Board Report No. 2,145, from January to December 1,943, output averaged 525 vehicles per month, totaling 21,147 DUKWs produced during the entire program. On the factory floor, the sound of hammers and welding echoed day and night. Each DUKW leaving the line carried the same mechanical soul. The chassis of the GMC CCKW 200 ton, a 270 horsepower engine, and a drive system optimized for both land and water. The unit price of $10,750 per vehicle was regarded as a triumph of production management. According to the U.S. Army Quartermaster Procurement Office, this cost equaled that of 7 Jeeps and was only 1/7 the cost of the German amphibious vehicle Landwasser Schlepper, LWS. The difference lay not only in price but in philosophy. While Germany clung to the model of perfect handcrafted mechanics, the United States chose mass production with tolerable error. A DUKW assembly line could complete an entire vehicle in 70 minutes, from raw steel frame to final coat of paint. On the factory wall, the production board's banner displayed a concise slogan: "Perfection delays victory. Efficiency wins it." According to the GMC engineering division, every DUKW was equipped with 3 standardized mechanical innovations: the central tire inflation system, CTIS, a 25-inch propeller, and a watertight welded steel hull reinforced with ribs. The CTIS allowed the driver to adjust tire pressure while the vehicle was in motion. On sand, pressure was lowered to 10–12 pounds per square inches to increase traction. On pavement, it was raised to 40–45 pounds per square inches for maximum speed. The 25-inch propeller, mounted behind the main drive shaft and controlled by a lever beside the driver's seat, could be stopped instantly when the vehicle reached land. The 1.6 mm thick steel hull was tested in pressure tanks to ensure zero leakage during 12 hours of continuous operation. Every component was standardized down to the last bolt, allowing complete interchangeability among vehicles, a feature unprecedented in the German military. Outside the factory, training units began to form. In May 1943, the first Amphibious truck company was established at Camp Gordon Johnston, Florida. Each unit had 50 DUKWs, 100 drivers and technicians, trained to operate alongside infantry, engineers, and logistics teams. According to the Army Ground Forces Training Manual, 1943, this was the first time in U.S. military history that an independent amphibious transport force existed, capable of combat operations without reliance on bridges or ports. They were informally called seagoing truckers. These soldiers carried both the spirit of long-haul drivers and the discipline of sailors. The War Department viewed the DUKW as a symbol of a new doctrine: mobility as strategy. Transportation was no longer a secondary function but the core of operational power. In a memorandum to General Dwight D. Eisenhower dated the 7th of August 1943, Chief of Transportation Charles Gross wrote, "The DUKW transforms every coastline into a potential road." He argued that America's advantage lay not in the number of tanks or artillery pieces, but in the ability to deliver everything to the right place, at the right time, regardless of rivers or seas. At the Pontiac plant, the assembly line operated under what economists would later call total integration. Every component, engine, wheel, propeller, hull, was produced in separate workshops, yet fit together with precision during assembly. Engineers used the first PERT charts ever applied in civilian industry to control production time for each component group. According to the War Department Industrial Efficiency Review, average assembly line delay was only 7 hours, a figure previously unheard of in military manufacturing. This process generated extraordinary productivity, ensuring that, however many DUKWs the battlefield required each day, the factory could deliver almost instantly. On the doctrinal front, the Army Service Forces issued Field Operations Bulletin No. 32, Amphibious Logistics, in October 1943, officially defining the concept of the Amphibious Truck Company as a hybrid operational logistics unit. The creation of these units laid the foundation for the mobile supply chain strategy, enabling Allied forces to maintain uninterrupted momentum from Sicily to Normandy. In his training report, Colonel William Thompson wrote, "A bridge limits you to 1 crossing point. A DUKW gives you 1,000. In the autumn of 1943, joint training exercises between DUKWs and Marine forces took place along the Atlantic coast. Archival footage from the U.S. Army Signal Corps shows dozens of DUKWs driving from sandy beaches into the water, then forming up like a convoy of floating trains. Engineer Frank Spear stood on the shore, holding a faded hard hat, his eyes reflecting on the water. "That's what we built it for," he murmured to the cameraman. Amid the roar of engines and the surf, that moment marked when an invention left the drawing board and became part of modern war industry. According to the post-war Technical Survey of Allied Logistics, 1946, 1943 was the turning point that transformed the DUKW from a technical concept into a logistics doctrine. From then on, in every amphibious campaign, the amphibious truck was not merely a transport vehicle, but a vital link in the chain of victory. Its power lay not in its rugged appearance, but in the production scale behind it, the factories, engineers, and workers who turned steel, oil, and time into mobility. While the Germans were still perfecting hand-welded LWS vehicles, the Americans had turned engineering into rhythm. In the hiss of presses and the flash of welding torches in 1943, modern warfare redefined itself. Victory no longer began on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. In the summer of 1943, the Mediterranean was engulfed in war. On July 10, Operation Husky began. Thousands of transport ships anchored off Sicily, forming a wall of steel stretching to the horizon. Among them, the first DUKWs rolled off the decks of landing ships and splashed into the water, carrying ammunition, rations, and men. According to the USBCO Navy Amphibious Operations Report, each vehicle carried an average of 5 tons of cargo or 25 soldiers, operating continuously for 72 hours in the opening phase. With waves reaching 3 meters and strong winds blowing, the DUKWs remained stable, their 270 horsepower GMC engines maintaining a steady 5.5 knots like clockwork. Upon reaching shore, the wheels gripped the sand and kept rolling, leaving behind propellers still dripping with seawater. The Naval Command described this as the first operational proof of amphibious logistics. Before this, every landing operation had depended on temporary bridges and transport boats. For the first time, a landing vehicle no longer needed to stop for loading and unloading. According to Allied Combined Operations Bulletin No. 54, within 12 hours after landing, DUKWs had delivered 90% of artillery ammunition and 70% of fuel to the entire Sicilian front. Major General Jacob Devers wrote in his diary, "Our trucks swim, our supplies never stop." The phrase quickly spread throughout the Allied forces, becoming the most precise summary of the American philosophy of industrial warfare. At Salerno, in September 1943, the DUKWs faced harsher trials. German artillery fired from the high ground down onto the beaches, rendering pontoon piers useless. The VI Corps Engineering Section reported, "When the causeways failed, the DUKWs kept the army alive. The amphibious trucks ran through the shell fire, carrying wounded men back to hospital ships, then returning with shells and gasoline. One vehicle took a direct artillery hit but stayed afloat, thanks to its watertight compartments and automatic bilge pumps." The story reached Washington, and during a year-end press briefing, Secretary Henry Stimson declared, "The DUKW proved its worth in blood and steel." At Anzio, early 1944, the DUKW's role expanded beyond logistics. When German guns targeted the main harbour, DUKWs were ordered to carry 105mm light howitzers and ammunition directly from ship to front line. According to the Fifth Army After-Action Report, in the first 3 days of the Anzio battle, 400 DUKWs completed over 2,800 trips, averaging 1 trip every 3 hours per vehicle. Drivers, often sailors or engineer privates, moved between sea and land as if the two were no longer distinct. One of them, Corporal Robert Simmons, recalled, "It felt like driving through chaos, but every trip meant more shells for the guns behind us." In June 1944, the DUKW faced its greatest trial, Operation Overlord. Before the Normandy landings, Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery inspected the test beaches at Devon. Watching the line of DUKWs rolling into the sea and climbing back onto shore, Montgomery said, "That's our insurance against weather." He understood that if storms destroyed the Mulberry artificial harbours, the DUKWs would keep operating. According to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, logistics report, between June 6 and June 13, DUKWs delivered more than 40% of total supplies to the Normandy beaches. Many operated under Force 8 winds, across waters littered with wreckage, yet maintained a 90% operational rate. A U.S. Army Signal Corps film captured an extraordinary sight. DUKWs moving in formation across the sea like a school of metallic fish, then crawling up Utah Beach, loaded with shells, mortars, and wounded soldiers. When a war correspondent asked Montgomery what made him confident the campaign would succeed, he replied, "Because we can move. They can't." On the other side, German intelligence was still trying to identify a small landing craft they believed the Allies used temporarily. In the 15th Army Intelligence Section file dated June 17, a note read, "The Americans employ a swimming truck for beach supply, not relevant for continental warfare." A cold remark, but one that marked the limit of the German General Staff's understanding. In reports after Normandy, the term amphibious truck began appearing more frequently, though only in appendices. None among the German command realized that the DUKW was no longer merely a supply tool, it had become the backbone of modern warfare. According to captured document number 2427, Oberkommando des Heers, German intelligence concluded that all of Europe was unsuitable for amphibious vehicles due to the lack of shallow beaches. They believed such vehicles could not operate on large rivers like the Rhine or the Danube. That belief left them entirely unprepared for attacks coming from the water. General Eisenhower later wrote in his memoir Crusade in Europe, "Our greatest advantage was not numbers nor firepower, but the ability to cross any terrain faster than the enemy could predict." He referred to the DUKW without naming it. The surviving Germans from Sicily or Normandy, once captured, expressed disbelief when they learned the true number. Over 2,000 vehicles operating across Europe. To them, it seemed a myth, an army capable of passing through every natural barrier. From 1943 to 1944, the DUKW crossed 3 seas, endured 3 climates, and proved itself in 3 major campaigns. It demonstrated that a machine could redefine warfare. From the sun-scorched sands of Sicily to the icy rocks of Normandy, the swimming truck carried with it a new philosophy of war. In the industrial age, victory belongs to those who can keep moving, and when Germany noted in its intelligence files that these swimming trucks have no value in continental warfare, it had unknowingly written the prophecy of its own defeat. In March 1945, the Western Front had narrowed into a long scar running along the Rhine River. That cold stretch of water, in the German mind, was the final wall between them and collapse. According to the Wehrmacht Engineering Command report, from January to early March, the German government had mobilized more than 200,000 civilian laborers and 15,000 military engineers to reinforce the defensive line. They dug trenches, built 3,000 concrete bunkers, laid minefields, and destroyed every bridge across the river from Cologne to Wesel. Each demolished bridge left black smoke veiling the sky. In documents from the Ministry of Propaganda, the Rhine was called Die Heilige Grenze, the sacred frontier. Veteran German officers who had fought on the Don and Dnieper rivers believed that no army could cross the Rhine without first constructing pontoon bridges. "The river itself will fight for us," declared General Albert Kesselring during a meeting in Bonn on March 10. He ordered the deployment of the 47th Panzer Corps, with about 150 tanks and self-propelled guns along the eastern bank, ready to counterattack any crossing point. According to the German Army Group H situation file, the counterattack plan was divided into 3 stages. Detect temporary bridges. Concentrate fire to destroy them, and launch armoured counterattacks within 72 hours. All of it was based on the assumption that the Allies would need to build bridges to cross the river. In the smoke-filled command rooms, maps spread across tables, red pencil lines marked potential crossing points. Intelligence officer Oberst Friedrich Wenzel of the 15th Army submitted a classified report on March 12, asserting that the British-American forces, quote, possess only about 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles, primarily for coastal logistics. The report was approved and archived in the Army Group B intelligence section, forming the foundation of the entire Rhine defense strategy. In the text, Wenzel noted, "There is no evidence indicating the enemy can deploy such vehicles on a strategic scale. It was the most costly mistake of his career." In reality, the situation on the opposite bank was entirely different. According to the US 21st Army Group Logistics Plan, by mid-March the Allies had concentrated more than 2,000 DUKWs and 600 Buffalo LVTs along the western bank from Nijmegen to Koblenz. Each vehicle was carefully maintained, covered with camouflage netting, and numbered by transport brigade. Secret river-crossing training units had been formed in the Masse region. In the Field Manual of Amphibious Operations, March 1945, Colonel William Thompson wrote, "We trained not to build bridges, but to replace them." The Allies were not preparing for a traditional river assault, they were preparing for an industrial mobile operation. The gap between perception and reality was most clearly revealed in Wehrmacht telegrams. On March 15, Field Marshal Kesselring received a report from the Defense Engineering Command stating that field pontoon bridges could support a 40-ton load under favorable conditions. He nodded and wrote a brief note in the margin. The enemy will need 72 hours to assemble such bridges. It was his final faith in the old rules of warfare. According to the US Army Historical Division, exactly 72 hours after that remark, American troops stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine, not by bridges, but by hundreds of DUKWs gliding across the water like a fleet of weightless trucks. While the Wehrmacht was pouring concrete, the Americans were packing crates. In Antwerp, thousands of boxes of ammunition and fuel were loaded onto DUKWs, ready to move to the river's edge. Colonel George Sims, logistics officer of the 16 Corps, described in his report, "Every truck was a bridge. Every driver was a crossing engineer. It was not mere metaphor. Thanks to the central tire inflation system, DUKWs could maneuver across any terrain from sand to mud to open water." While the Rhine current churned, the Allies had turned the concept of riverbank into launch point. In Berlin, the Ministry of Propaganda released leaflets titled Der Rhein wird halten, the Rhine will hold. Images of German engineers guarding the banks appeared everywhere, portraying the Rhine as the final fortress. Yet in the Wehrmacht's logistics reports, the signs of exhaustion were unmistakable. Fuel reserves for artillery were sufficient for only 3 days of combat. Pontoon bridge stockpiles were 65% below requirements. Meanwhile, across the river, Montgomery had completed the positioning of the British Second Army and the US Ninth Army. From March 18, DUKWs were hidden under forest cover along the Nijmegen-Wesel line, only 5 miles from the river. According to the 21st Army Group Reconnaissance Report, every unit knew precisely when and where to cross. DUKW drivers trained to calculate drift angles in 8-10 knot currents, adjusting their entry points to land exactly where planned. During the final exercises, they were ordered to maintain total silence, no lights, no return fire. By mid-March, everything was ready, while across the river, the Wehrmacht still believed the Rhine crossing would require at least 2 weeks of preparation. General Kesselring wrote in his diary on March 20, "The Americans are gathering, but the river will stop them. Even Napoleon failed here." He had no idea that the vehicles waiting across the river were no longer trucks but mobile bridges. According to post-war Allied interrogation records, when questioned after the war, a German officer admitted, "We waited for bridges. We did not expect an army that could drive across the river." From March 1 to 22, 2 opposing worlds existed on either side of the Rhine. One placed its faith in concrete, bunkers, and military tradition. The other in assembly lines, engineering, and speed. The workers in Pontiac, the engineers in Michigan, and the soldiers in the Masse training camps were completing the final piece of victory. In his command bunker, when Kesselring insisted, "They will need 72 hours to build a bridge," history had already begun its countdown. 72 hours later, the wheels of the DUKWs would roll into the Rhine, and the entire German defense line built on illusion would dissolve like smoke over that sacred river. At dawn on the 27th of March 1945, the gunfire along the west bank of the Rhine subsided, giving way to mechanical sounds, the engines of DUKWs and tanks echoing through the fog. Amphibious trucks crawled out of the water, their hulls still dripping, carrying shells, wounded soldiers, and reinforcements. According to the US 9th Army operational report, by that point, over 16,000 German soldiers had been captured within the first 72 hours. The 1st Parachute Army, once hailed as the final elite force of Nazi Germany, collapsed in all directions. The situation map dated March 28 showed their symbols nearly erased, replaced by blue arrows of the Allied advance. Reports recovered from German headquarters near Wesel recorded the chaos. A staff officer wrote, "There is no defensive line, only scattered groups holding roads." The battle they called the River's Last Stand had turned into a mass retreat. While British artillery bombarded deep into the Ruhr, convoys of DUKWs continued crossing the river, transporting 125 tons of supplies per hour. According to Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, the trucks kept running like a factory belt across a river instead of a floor. The Rhine, once regarded as Europe's wall, had become America's logistical conveyor belt. On March 28, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived in Wesel to witness what he called the end of the last barrier. In Montgomery's memoirs, he noted that Churchill ignored all security warnings and demanded to cross to the East Bank himself. An LCVP was prepared, but Churchill chose instead a US Navy DUKW. The image of the Prime Minister, in a grey overcoat and with his cigar still glowing red, standing in the back of the truck as it left the water, became symbolic of the moment Britain stepped onto German soil. When the wheels touched ground, Churchill stooped, grabbed a handful of mud, and said, "German soil." Then he turned to Montgomery. They did not defeat the river. They ignored it. That line, later quoted in the British War Office memoirs, captured perfectly the essence of the Rhine victory. In interrogation rooms at Kleve, the first testimonies revealed the Wehrmacht's shock. A lieutenant from the 84th Division said, "We waited for bridges, they never built them. We did not understand." Another soldier wrote in his diary, "The trucks came out of the water like animals. We shot, but there were always more." The Allied Psychological Warfare Division's summary quoted one prisoner saying a line that became legendary. "The Battle of the Rhine was lost in Detroit, not in Wesel." That brief sentence reflected a truth Germany had never wanted to face, that modern war was no longer decided by tactics but by industry. In the final days of March, Allied forces advanced at an average speed of 50 miles per day, 3 times faster than expected. According to the US Army After Action report, the DUKWs not only carried troops but also towed 105mm howitzers, jeeps, and mobile communication units. Flooded roads, small streams, and canals once marked by the Wehrmacht as natural obstacles became thoroughfares. A captured German officer at Dorsten recalled, "We saw American tanks where we had no bridges. Then we saw trucks swimming. We knew it was over." In Berlin, within the Reich Chancellery bunker, Adolf Hitler received reports of the Rhine defence's collapse. According to the German Situation Conference transcript, he erupted in rage, throwing maps onto the table and shouting, "Who allowed this? Where are our counterattacks?" No answer came. General Alfred Jodl remained silent, then murmured, "The river is gone." In the final conference on March 29, Hitler uttered what historians regard as his only admission. "We prepared for the wrong war." His private secretary Gertrude Jung noted that he repeated the word Fabrik, factory, several times, as if realizing that Germany had been crushed by the enemy's assembly lines. That same day, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding the Rhine defense, ordered a full retreat toward the Ruhr to rebuild a line. But it was futile. Supply routes were severed, fuel was exhausted, and German troops surrendered in groups of hundreds. According to the 21st Army Group Intelligence Summary, in just March 30-31, the British and Americans captured 9,000 prisoners and seized more than 1,200 vehicles. DUKW convoys kept crossing the river, carrying food, ammunition, and returning with the wounded. The column stretched from Wesel to Dortmund, a massive chain of steel in motion. On the evening of March 30, at Montgomery's headquarters, senior officers gathered to assess the campaign. On the table lay a flattened German map, blue pencils marking thick arrows eastward. Montgomery said simply, "Gentlemen, we have entered Germany as if it had no borders." Silence lingered for a few seconds before weary laughter broke out. Everyone understood that what had just occurred was no longer a battle. It was the collapse of a century-old military doctrine. The next morning, Eisenhower arrived at the scene. He watched the DUKWs climb the bank, sunlight glinting off their olive-drab paint. "With these," he said to Bradley, "every obstacle is a myth." Bradley nodded, replying, "And myths don't fight back." According to the Supreme Headquarters field log, that exchange was recorded verbatim, a succinct definition of the difference between two worlds, one bound to classical tactics, the other driven by mechanics and mass production. On March 31, the gunfire along the Rhine fell silent. The Wehrmacht no longer had the strength to counterattack. The remaining units retreated south in despair, while Allied and British DUKW convoys continued to cross the river, steady as an industrial current. In his field journal, a British officer wrote, "We did not conquer the Rhine. We commuted across it." That simple sentence closed the final chapter of the Industrial War, where wheels and steel triumphed over every classical doctrine. And in the quiet after victory, Europe understood that from Wesel to Berlin, not only an army had fallen, but an entire era of artful warfare had come to its end. In May 1945, when the guns of Europe finally fell silent, the DUKWs that had crossed the Rhine were not left behind on the battlefield. They kept moving now with a different mission. According to the U.S. Army Transportation Corps post-war report, during the 2 months following the German surrender, DUKW units crossed the Elbe and Danube rivers, carrying food, medicine, and clothing to the exhausted German population. In Hamburg, where the river was choked with mud and wrecked ships, the amphibious trucks were the only vehicles able to reach the isolated neighborhoods. A mechanic of the 336th Amphibious Truck Company, Sergeant Paul Morrison, recalled that he once drove through flooded streets to deliver bread and milk to children. "We were delivering life instead of war," he said at a veterans meeting in 1985, according to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1,946. The Rhine crossing campaign had shortened the European war by at least 3 weeks and saved approximately 50,000 Allied lives. The report concluded, "No single piece of equipment contributed more to the speed of Germany's collapse than the DUKW." That statement was not merely praise, it was recognition that victory had come from industrial efficiency. By transforming logistics into technology, the United States had redefined the tempo of warfare. Instead of waiting, they created pace. Beginning in 1946, the U.S. Department of Defense considered reusing the DUKW for humanitarian missions. Hundreds of vehicles were transferred to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, for operations in the Netherlands, Austria, and Italy. The machines that had once carried shells now transported powdered milk, medical kits, and wheat. In Rotterdam, children ran after the still olive-painted trucks, calling them Schwimmwagen, the same nickname German soldiers had once used in mockery. This time, they brought life. According to the European Relief Operations Summary, during the latter half of 1945, DUKWs transported more than 500,000 tons of food across flooded regions. From a technical perspective, the DUKW became the model for post-war industrial philosophy. War Department Technical Bulletin No. 9/12/1947 defined the fundamental principle behind its success. Adequacy plus quantity equals victory. Every component of the DUKW was designed to be good enough, not perfect, but stable, fast to produce, and easy to replace. This doctrine spread throughout the entire American civilian industry after the war, from automobiles and railroads to aviation. Engineer Frank Spear of GMC, who had designed the DUKW's bilge pump system, later served as an advisor for the defense truck program and remarked, "We didn't design beauty, we designed reliability." According to NATO operational doctrine, 1951, the lessons of the Rhine crossing were incorporated into continental warfare training. Member nations began to regard amphibious mobility as a standard requirement. The United Kingdom built the Alvis Stalwart, while the Soviet Union developed the BTR Amphibious series and the PTSM, all directly influenced by the DUKW. In the Soviet Military Engineering Review, 1957, Colonel Ivan Yakushin wrote, "The Americans solved river crossing through production, not heroism." That remark reflected a global shift in military thinking. Victory would no longer be measured by courage, but by systematic manufacturing capacity. During the Cold War, the DUKW continued to serve. In Korea, it was used for artillery transport along the Nakdong River. In Vietnam, the same generation of vehicles operated in the flooded Mekong Delta. According to the U.S. Army Mobility Report, 1966, more than 70% of DUKWs remained operational after over 2 decades, proving the durability of their design. Some were modified for rescue operations and even deployed in U.S. flood relief missions during the 1970 seconds. But the DUKW's legacy was not merely mechanical, it transformed humanity's perception of the relationship between machines and geography. Before 1945, rivers, mountains, and wetlands were considered strategic barriers. After the war, such barriers became problems solvable by engineering. Military historian John Keegan wrote, "The DUKW erased the line between sea and land." His statement described more than a vehicle, it defined a shift from terrain-based warfare to logistics-based warfare. In Western military academies of the 1952nd, the Rhine crossing became a core lesson in the curriculum Logistics and Mobility. Charts recorded the data precisely. 21,147 DUKWs produced, 5,000 river crossings, 3,000 tons of cargo delivered in 72 hours. Each figure served as evidence of a new doctrine that the speed of supply determined the outcome of battle. At the 1963 NATO conference, a German delegate declared, "We lost to engineers, not to soldiers." The room fell silent. That admission closed the historical circle, as those who once dismissed the swimming trucks now publicly acknowledged their power. By 1985, when veterans who had driven DUKWs gathered in Lexington, Kentucky, the surviving vehicles were repainted in their original colors. On the grass, old soldiers stood beside the machines that had carried them across the Rhine 40 years earlier. One of them, Sergeant James Mitchell, looked at the rust-streaked hull and said slowly, "It's ugly, but it worked, and it ended a war." The crowd fell silent, then applause broke through under the afternoon Sunday. From the test fields of Michigan to the waters of the Rhine, from battlefronts to humanitarian relief, the DUKW had completed the journey of an icon. It was no longer merely a product of war, but proof that technical intellect and mass production could reshape the world. In the 20th century, as the boundaries between land and water dissolved and between war and industry blurred, the DUKW was more than a transport vehicle. It was evidence that in the age of machines, victory belonged to those nations that could transform steel, sweat, and time into absolute mobility. Thank you for following this journey, where numbers, people, and machines have told the story of an unforgettable era in the history of world aviation. We are committed to continuing to bring you the finest content, recreating the battles that have shaped the modern world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more battles.